Okay, it's live.
Good evening, everybody. Yeah, good evening, everybody. Sean Casten here. Thanks for joining in. We're doing a session tonight. I'll give a little bit of update of what we did in Washington this past week with the latest expansion, but we really want to focus. We've done a number of these on small business programs that we've done. Have done a number with local state officials to tie in what's going on at the state level in Illinois. And we have the good fortune tonight to be joined by Susan Gaines, who is the Congressional Liaison for the IRS, who has direct experience with the implementation of the program in the CARES Act that provided $1,200 per individual to families all across the country, families making less than $75,000 per person, $150,000 per household, and then declining payments. And of course, those checks are all going out right now. So I will turn over to Susan for her expertise, then we'll run through what we've done in Washington this week and then open up to your questions. If you have questions at any time, put them in the comment feed here down at the bottom, and we will funnel them through to Gwen, who's sitting next to me, and we'll read them as they come up on the Google Doc. And let me now turn over to Susan. Susan, by the way, is calling in from Kentucky with not the best broadband access, so we'll be on the phone. So you won't have a visual of her, but she's got a presentation as well. So Susan, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and hello, Congressman Casten, and hello, viewers. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you all this evening. As Congressman Casten said, I'm a Congressional District Liaison with the Internal Revenue Service. I cover the states of Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, and Tennessee. And I've worked with the IRS for over 30 years now in various roles. I've worked clerical, I've worked customer service, I've worked IRS management, I've been a practitioner liaison, and most recently am now a Congressional District Liaison. Now, as a district liaison, I have the responsibility of managing the IRS's relationship with the local congressional offices in my assigned states. I provide the congressional staff with information on tax law changes, current programs, and other areas that might be of interest to the congressional staff. I also work jointly with the IRS's local taxpayer advocate to provide outreach to local congressional delegations. And I spend quite a bit of my time fielding questions from the staff of these congressional offices, and those questions usually relate to IRS policies, procedures, and other non-tax account related inquiries. Now, for example, I often receive questions from Congressman Casten's staff about certain tax laws or IRS procedures, such as where to send a certain inquiry, the status of an organization's request to be considered tax exempt, how to request a penalty abatement. And lately, we've been dealing with many questions on the economic impact payments or stimulus payments. Now, before I get started with the Congressman and answering some of your questions, I just want to make sure that I mention how much I appreciate Congressman Casten's staff. They are working so hard to get you answers, not just to your IRS questions, but reaching out to many government agencies to get assistance for you with a variety of the issues that you may be facing. So Congressman Casten, I just really want to thank your staff for their tireless work on behalf of your constituents. I know they're fielding many questions related to IRS activities right now.
Thank you, Susan. So let me give, as you all think about your questions, let me give a little bit of update on what we've done so far in coronavirus, and maybe just at least set a little context for you. This is unprecedented in our history. We have never had I suppose we've had a global pandemic this scale, in the modern era back in 1918, but certainly I think not in the lives of anybody on this call, unless we've got some fairly elderly folks joining us today. But never, Ben Bernanke told us that this will be the deepest economic downturn since we have started recording data. We've already seen, unemployment in the double digits, approaching 20%. And what I can't stress enough is that this is a public health crisis and an economic crisis. We cannot decouple those two from each other. If we hadn't taken the measures we'd taken to shut down the economy, we would be looking at hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans dead right now. So it was the right thing to shut it down so that people are alive, but there are consequences of that people obviously can't work. And so we've tried to do everything we can to shorten that time frame of the shutdown. So we have now passed 4 bills related to that. The first was a $8.3 billion with a B dollar bill that was focused primarily on moving more money into the development of vaccines and treatments. And then also, in addition to that $8.3 billion, expanded the Small Business Authority's lending capacity by $7 billion for what were called economic injury disaster loans, so that small businesses could get support, recognizing the unusual nature of this crisis. We then passed a roughly $100 billion Families First Act that started to address some of the economic pain to individuals who were affected by COVID. So this had provisions in it like expanding the unemployment insurance program, expanding Medicare payments to the states, providing businesses who had employees who needed to take longer sick leave or to care for a loved one to have resources to cover that cost if they were already through their sick time allotments for the year, extended disability if they became symptomatic. And then that bill also had things like expanded food aid for folks who need more food assistance. And we then passed the enormous $2.2 trillion CARES Act. Now, every bill that I've just described was overwhelmingly bipartisan, bicameral. It's been a nice sign of the entire government working in real time to work through and get these things done. The CARES Act was a much broader bill dealing with the larger systemic issues in the economy. And I can't go through all those right now, but the big pieces were this payment that we mentioned, that is the $1,200 payment per individual, and getting those processes set up. The expanded lending authority that the Federal Reserve has to make sure that larger employers have access to capital markets and liquidity. The PPP program, which has been in the news a lot, which provides funding for businesses specifically to retain their employees. So the amount you can borrow from the PPP program is not a function of your credit. It's not a function of the size of your business. It's a function of essentially your head count. You can borrow up to 2.5 times your monthly payroll, and there's no credit check on that. And as long as you spend that money for payroll, the loan can be converted into a grant. There's some rules on that. But these were the things that were in the CARES Act. There were other pieces in there as well, but those programs were largely consumed really pretty quickly. And so we went back to Washington last week to vote on, and I'm not even sure what the name of this, we've been internally calling it CARES 2. I'm sure that's not the name, but it was essentially an injection of another $300 billion into the PPP program, because we had $397 billion had gone out into the economy within the 2.5 weeks since we passed it. So we expanded that by another $300 billion, and then also put an additional $100 billion into our healthcare system. That was $75 billion to hospitals specifically, because hospitals have been under increasing stress as their normal revenue models have been squeezed. They're not doing the high margin things they used to, but they're treating a lot of patients who are coming in through emergency rooms and through Medicaid that are squeezing their margins. Obviously, for a lot of obvious reasons, make sure they're running. And then $25 billion for expanded testing. We're not done yet. The U.S. payroll runs about $1 trillion a week. And there is simply nobody other than the federal government who has the ability to backstop that kind of expense. And we are also working extremely hard to try to balance the tension between getting that money out the door quickly and getting the money out the door efficiently. And there's a desire to do both. There's also a recognition that it's just impossible to do both And by efficiently, I mean, is the money getting where it's needed? So as an example, in the PPP program, nonprofits are historically not eligible for small business loans. Well, we know that a lot of nonprofits are providing absolutely critical services, and they have employees too, people working in the food pantries, um, a whole host of nonprofit health providers. So we expanded the PPP program to include nonprofits, but as the program was rolled out, the banks tended to bias towards existing customers, and there were some paperwork issues. Most of those are behind us, but we did have to expand a bit in the most recent expansion of the PPP to try to expand the range of providers to include community banks, credit unions, folks who get at people sort of deeper down in the economy, smaller lenders, less sophisticated businesses who are just as critical to our employment. As we move forward in the next piece, I think we are all keenly aware that what we failed to get bipartisan agreement for in the last piece wasn't for lack of pushing, we just couldn't get bipartisan agreement, was to get money to states and municipalities. And in the same way that the Paycheck Protection Program was designed to get money into workers' hands, there are folks who work as firefighters, as policemen, as school teachers, the people who work in the unemployment office in the state to make sure that unemployment benefits are paid. These people are all municipal and state employees, but they didn't have access to those resources from the programs we put out. And those state resources are getting really squeezed. So we're going to have to expand the support for municipalities, for counties, for states. We're going to have to deal with the burdens on the postal system going forward, because as we all stay home and order more, the postal service is getting constrained, and we'll have to push through. And my expectation is we will probably be back in Washington in 2 to 3 weeks to do another package, but I don't want to predict what's going to be in that package yet. But we continue to push and continue to really value your feedback of where your needs are, where you're seeing gaps, so that we can keep working on this in real time. Because if anybody tells you that they have direct personal experience figuring out how to inject $3 trillion into the economy in 45 days, I'd love to meet them. We're all trying to figure this out in real time. So thank you for all that you're doing. I know so many of you have stepped up in so many ways, large and small, public and private. And as I sort of look out and have the pleasure to chat with so many constituents lately, I'm just struck by how many people need a shoulder to lean on and how many people are offering a shoulder for someone else to lean on. So thanks for all you're doing, for staying strong so we can get through this together. With that as background, hopefully we've triggered some thoughts on your end. And again, if you have a question, put it in the comment thread. And I will now turn over to my off-camera anchor to read the questions either for myself or Susan.
So this question is for either of you, from Dean, who is asking, how do you check the status of your EIP if you only have a telephone and do not have internet access? I'm a volunteer income tax assistant for the AARP and haven't received an answer to that question.
Susan, can you answer that one?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Dean, the best thing that you can do is to reach out to a friend or family member that does have internet access. Unfortunately, many of the IRS employees are also home with COVID-19 restrictions, stay at home, shelter in place, those kinds of things. And so they're unable to answer our phones right now. Now, later in the year, hopefully sooner rather than later, but we will get those folks back to work and you will be able to call the IRS and check on it. But currently, the only option is to have internet access and to use the tool on irs.gov called Get Your Payment. And that tool will help you track your stimulus payment, your economic impact payment.
All right, Dad, this question is for you. Lisa has heard that independent contractors / 1099 contractors are getting denied for unemployment benefits. She was led to believe that gig economy workers and independent contractors were covered by the new stimulus bill.
So please follow up with our office with the specifics and we can help you out. We did, and this is sort of similar to the PPP program where I mentioned that there's this tension between efficiency and speed. The unemployment insurance program, you are absolutely right, historically has not, has been much more biased towards W-2 employees than 1099s or people with substantial tipped wages. We did amend the rules in the unemployment insurance program to try to cover folks like yourself. And so legally that's true. There also have been challenges and hiccups on rollout just because doing something at this scale with agencies that are not necessarily scaled up to do that, when the rules are changing a bit and maybe don't fit exactly their old forms, there have been some hiccups and delays, but I would encourage you to follow up with our office and we'll see if we can help you out.
HL filed 2018 taxes, but has yet to file 2019 taxes. When might he receive his economic impact payment?
I'll take that one. If he has filed 18, he will most likely receive his payment soon. He can again use that Get My Payment tool on irs.gov. If we do not have direct deposit information on file for him, he can use that tool to provide the IRS with his direct deposit information, which will speed up the receipt of that economic impact payment.
The other thing that I add for you, HL, and Susan, please correct me if I've got this wrong. Secretary Mnuchin told us that the sequencing they were going to use was first to make payments to people who had direct deposit information on file, and then to make snail mail distributions, and that the snail mail distributions would go in reverse AGI order. So starting with people who had the lowest income and would therefore get the largest check, and then gradually working through. So depending on what your income was in the most recent tax year, the higher it was, the longer it will take for you to see that check as the Treasury Department tries to prioritize the people who are most in need. Susan, I don't know if correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I don't know if you have any color on where we are in that sequence right now.
I have not seen that through IRS channels. I did hear Mnuchin's comment on it, but we are starting to issue paper checks. I've heard from several people already this week that are starting to receive their paper checks. So we are definitely in that first phase with the lower AGI, the lower adjusted gross income, the lower income people receiving their checks, paper checks already.
Okay, thank you.
This question is for either of you. Dave emailed this question. My son is a 19-year-old college student claimed as a dependent on my tax return. He had a part-time job and filed a tax return. Will he receive a stimulus payment? Should he file for unemployment?
Susan, you want to take that?
I'll take the first part of that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll take the first part. The unemployment, I'll leave to you. If he is claimed as a dependent on his parents' tax return, since he is 19, neither his parents nor he will receive an economic impact payment for him. Now, with that said, if the economic impact payments are actually an advanced credit for tax year 2020, so if for tax year 2020, this 19-year-old college student becomes independent, then he may be able to claim the $1,200 stimulus payment on his 2020 tax return that he files in 2021.
And I'm not sure that I would be the right person to advise your son on whether or not he should file for unemployment without having a little bit more details about your situation that are probably not appropriate to go through here. But again, if our office can help you think through that, please feel free to give us a ring afterwards.
So this question is from Steve, who says that they got their 2019 tax refund from the IRS on April 22nd, just 8 days after they filed their return, but still no EIP. Steve is asking how this could be since their info is on file with the IRS. And Jim has a related question for those who e-filled their 2019 returns in early April and had them fully processed by mid-April and qualify for the payment. Why would the IRS website show payment status not available? When will the IRS or Treasury correct records and reprocess those payments for eligible recipients?
Okay, so it's going to take a couple weeks after they file the return for the IRS to to look for that return and process an economic impact payment. I'm sorry, IRS and our acronyms. So it'll take 2 to 3 weeks before the IRS will actually reprocess that return and look for it. If they had direct deposit on file, it should be coming soon. And as far as Jim's question, again, if it was fully processed by mid-April, it should be just a few weeks again if they had direct deposit on file. But that Get My Payment tool that I have referred to a couple times, that is updated every day. So we're telling people no need to check more than once a day, but you can check it every day. And as more and more tax returns are processed, we're adding those people to the system. So that is your best source to find out when you should receive your payment, that Get My Payment tool on irs.gov.
This question is for Ms. Gaines. Melissa is asking why the IRS is processing automatic payments from her bank account for 2 months now, if those IRS payments were supposed to be suspended.
That's a good question, Melissa. Actually, the IRS relief for coronavirus does allow people to not have to make those payments. But if it's already set up as a direct debit from your bank account, you'll have to ask your bank to stop those payments for you. The IRS has no authority to tell your bank whether or not to send someone a payment. So you'll have to reach out to your bank and ask that they stop the payments. And then you'll have to remember after July 15th, when the relief ends, you'll need to go back to your bank and ask them to start the payments up again, or use the IRS's online payment agreement tool to reinitiate those direct debits.
Amanda has a question probably for you, Dad. She asks, with the real possibility of large-scale unemployment lasting for months until we have a vaccine, is there any word on further individual stimulus or a universal basic minimum income?
It's an excellent question and one that we are all grappling with in real time. There are multiple proposals going around on things ranging from I think Congresswoman Jayapal from Washington State has been the primary champion of a program that would essentially, I'm oversimplifying it, but would essentially do the PPP program, but direct to individuals, and so would pay everybody. I've seen various drafts. I think the latest draft is talking about something like 80% of your income through July. That's expensive, obviously, but then again, everything we're doing right now is expensive. And so there are ideas kicking around about how to do that. I would be reluctant to handicap which of those have the legs to go forward, which of them can get the votes on the floor. And there's also just this challenge, which is I don't mean to make this sound overly academic, but it's relatively straightforward for us to expand existing programs. So expanding the Small Business Authority, expanding the unemployment insurance program. It's much more complicated to come up with whole new programs like UBI, because you have to get into these questions of who's eligible, how do you make sure you have accurate files, how do you calculate the numbers, how do you deal with tipped wages, how do you deal with 1099 employees, people whose income is more volatile. And those are all solvable problems, but solving those problems correct takes time. And so some of these ideas that are out there that have a lot of support still have a lot of commitment to making sure that they don't have unintended consequences. So my guess is we probably won't have all those mechanics sorted out in the next package, but I am hopeful that we will be in a position to have some hearings, maybe have some experts testify and start working through some of those nuances so that we can at least have the tool in our quiver should we need it.
This one is for Miss Gaines. Bruce sent an email asking, my brother and his wife are on social Social Security just like me, but they have received their EIP and I have not. What did I do wrong and what do I need to do to fix it? The Where's My Payment tool tells me that payment information is not available at this time. Karen would like to know if you are on Social Security disability, do you need to do anything to receive your stimulus check? Courtney has the same question. When will Social Security beneficiaries who are non-fillers receive their stimulus checks?
Shoot. Okay, that's a mouthful. Bruce's question, my brother and his wife are on Social Security. They've gotten theirs, but I haven't. Everybody's tax situation's differently. It may be that Bruce and his wife may be required to file a tax return. So everybody's situation's different. If your only income is Social Security, those checks are just starting to go out this week. And so within the next few weeks, you should have yours. Now, the Where's My Payment tool, it doesn't always have everyone's information, especially those that don't file tax returns, because we have to verify your identity before we can give you that information. And so it may be that we don't have enough identifying information on you in order to verify you, in order to give you that information. Now, Karen wants to know about all she has is Social Security disability. Does she need to do anything? Karen, if you don't have any dependents under the age of 17, then no, you do not need to do anything. Your economic impact payment, your EAP, is going to come the same way that your Social Security benefits do. So if you get your Social Security by paper check, it'll come that way. If you have direct deposit, then it will come direct deposit. And if you use one of the Social Security Administration's direct express cards, then it will come on that card. But that should be coming, like I said, within the next couple weeks. And then Courtney said, who are non-filers, same thing, when will you receive yours? Again, in the next few weeks. Nobody needs to do anything unless they have dependents or a spouse that doesn't have any income. You want to use the IRS's non-filer tool. So it says when you go to irs.gov, it's one of the first options on the top left of the page. It says non-filers, get your payment and, enter your payment information here. And so you can click on that and it'll give you an opportunity to set up an account and actually submit some information to the IRS to get the payments for your dependent children or your spouse. But Social Security, railroad retirement, those folks are coming out now. SSI and VA recipients that don't file tax returns, yours will be coming out about the middle of May.
All right, Delilah has a child support question. Is owed child support taken from the non-custodial parent stimulus payment? If so, is a percentage of the owed amount forwarded to the custodial parent?
That is another good question that we're receiving a lot. So the CARES Act stated that these payments will not be offset for anything other than back child support. So if a married couple owes back child, or one of the spouses owes back child support, then the liable spouse, actually the whole payment could be offset to the child support debt. With that said, if the constituents filed a injured spouse form with their tax return, although the entire amount will be offset, the IRS will be able to reach back out to through the Bureau of Financial Services to the Child Support Agency and recoup half. So 50% of whatever that EAP was, that economic impact payment, 50% of that will be routed back to the non-liable spouse, but that will take a little bit of time. Now, if someone has not filed an injured spouse form with their tax return, the IRS is still working on guidance on how someone may be able to file an injured spouse form. And just for the form number is 8379. But anyway, the IRS is working on a process to allow people that may not have already filed that form to be able to file that and claim their, as a non-liable spouse, their portion of the economic impact payment.
Catherine has a question for you, Dad. Is there a plan to have the companies that are benefiting from the pandemic help share in the cost?
So what we have done, and really, I hate to say this is a blessing, but we have the benefit of a number of members, both of Congress and staff, and recently retired people from the executive branch who had direct experience with 2008. And there was significant concern from those who were involved in the 2008 bailout that in many cases distributions were made to companies that then use that money for dividends, for executive compensation. In some cases, later filed for bankruptcy and wiped out pensions, and there was no recourse. And so what we sought to do is not is essentially put strings on the money to make sure that the money got to where it needed to go. So that's why in the PPP program, the amount you can borrow is a function of payroll. And if you want the option to have this treated as a grant rather than a loan you have to repay to the federal government, you need to use at least 75% of that money on payroll and rent and expenses that keep the economy running. In the larger package for larger organizations, in the provision, if you look for some of the airlines, there are provisions that says if you take these sort of disaster relief funds during the time when you're benefiting from those funds, you can't make dividend payments, you can't do stock buybacks, you can't reopen collective bargaining agreements. So it wasn't so much mandating that companies step up to do the job of government as to make sure that if the companies are going to take advantage of government checks, they're going to use that portion of the money to keep people employed, to make sure that we are continuing to make sure that everybody has their basic needs met. The next step in what I personally believe we should be doing, what I think most of my colleagues in the House believe we should be doing, is really to the executive branch, because the ability to compel companies to act in the national interest is vested in the executive branch. That's through the Defense Production Act. You've probably heard a lot about that in the news. And imagine, if you will, and I say this as a former CEO and entrepreneur, I was accountable to a board of directors. I was accountable to investors. And if I had something that morally I thought was a great thing to do, but would have compromised our free cash flow, I would have had to get approval from my board for that. And you might or might not get approval from your board for that. What the Defense Production Act gives the president the authority to do is to direct companies to say, we need you to fill in the blank, make N95 masks, make swabs, increase the production of reagents. We'll reimburse you, but we're going to reimburse you at this margin. And essentially, you give you have the power of the federal government to force that, and you also give the executives, if you will, that you avoid the fight with the board because they say, I have to do this. It's in the national interest to do it. The president has yet to fully implement the Defense Production Act. And I personally believe that that's a part of why we've seen not as rapid a ramp up in personal protective equipment and test kits as we should. But that authority, again, is in the executive branch, not the legislative, other than in our ability to put some pressure on them to do that.
Becky, who did file a 2018 and is on SSDI, has a question about the ability to check for the status of the stimulus payment online. She keeps getting the message that this U.S. government system is for authorized use only. What should Becky do?
Yes, Becky, that's another good question. Now that this system is for authorized use only, that's just the jurat to make sure that you are you. So we want to, give you the warning that you should be the only person accessing that system to obtain your personal tax information, which includes the amount or the status of your stimulus payment. So you just need to click OK on that box and continue on.
Okay, William asks, my wife has gotten direct deposit from the IRS in the past. Why is she getting a check instead of direct deposit?
Okay, William, there could be a couple of factors. Sometimes when people use tax software or pay a income tax preparer to do their tax return, they actually set up a bank account for you in order to be able to withdraw their fees for using the software or for using the paid income tax preparer services. So they have to have a way to recoup the fees if you can't pay them up front. So they'll set up a separate bank account for that. And I'm wondering if this is not the case. Is it possible that she used one of these services and that they had to set up a separate account for the fees? If so, then that account has probably been closed since then, and the bank that was set up for has rejected the direct deposit, and the IRS is going to mail a paper check based on that. The only other reason it could be is if for whatever reason her bank rejected the direct deposit. So if we've got direct deposit on file, we're picking that information up off the most recently processed tax return. So she might want to pull out her tax return and see where that direct deposit was scheduled for. But the good news is that it will at least come in that paper check if the account's been closed.
Okay, Dad, Stasia would like to know, what are the plans to support frontline hospital workers?
So number one, thank you to all the frontline hospital workers who are keeping us healthy, keeping us safe. I think most of the, there's a couple things that we can do. Number one, we have to do everything to get more PPE available and out there. And that goes back to pushing to increase production, to try to debottleneck. And that's really a whole of government effort. You've probably heard the White House talking about their Project Airbridge, which is being run through FEMA to get resources from around the country and get it into locations in the US. There have been efforts by both state and federal emergency management agencies to try and prioritize PPE to those regions of the country that are seeing the highest volume of cases. At the same time, I think we all recognize that we have more needs than resources for too many parts of our personal protective equipment, and we should be doing a better job of that. And that's why I keep coming back to this Defense Production Act. We have the ability to produce more. We just need to provide companies with the direction to do so. The other thing that we're doing, and this is incomplete, but we're still working through it. And I'd love to hear if you're, offline, maybe follow up if you're seeing gaps in this. We've provided hundreds of billions of dollars of reimbursement and support to the hospitals because so many of the hospitals' budgets have been squeezed by this crisis. The coronavirus has disproportionately hurt minority communities, has disproportionately hurt lower income communities, which has caused a huge, and of course has disproportionately affected the elderly, which means that the hospitals are seeing a disproportionately large increase in Medicaid and Medicare payments, which of course are not as profitable to the hospital as elective surgeries and things that they might usually do. Thank you to all of our hospitals for providing those services and working through that, but it's creating a lot of financial tension, which of course limits the hospital's resources to protect the frontline healthcare workers. The Department of Health and Human Services was tasked with figuring out how to allocate those funds that we approved through Congress through to the healthcare systems. The first tranche that they did, they had to figure out some protocol to index it, and they chose to index it based on Medicare loading. Now, personally, I think that was probably a mistake. And I think in hindsight, they would probably agree with that as well, but they felt they needed to get it out the door quick. The reason why I say it's a mistake is that you really should be following where the patient load is from COVID. not who happened to be treated with Medicare in the past. The HHS subsequently sent out surveys to all the hospitals in the country asking them to provide details of patient loading so that they could do some true-up payments. And it's my understanding that that second tranche of money is now being released from HHS to try to catch up and get to those hospitals that were under-rewarded in the last round. Those, I've heard some hospitals have started to receive that this week, but hopefully that gets the hospital to a point where at least some of the financial pressures of keeping the hospital doors open go away. And then I suppose I just say the last thing is just making sure that we get this under control, which means making sure we have testing, making sure we do contact tracing, making sure that we do isolation, because that's how we're going to minimize the caseload coming through the hospitals until such time as we have a vaccine and some antiviral treatment. Thank you.
All right, Steve used the Get My Payment tool. It told him the information he entered didn't agree with their records, even though it's the same info on his tax return. Prior to that, he received an unable to calculate your payment at this time message. What should he do?
Steve, there are some things that we're learning about the tool even here at the IRS as we go along. So the first thing I want to recommend is that if your use your 2018 tax return information. The second thing is when you're typing your address, make sure that you put it in all capital letters. And exactly like it is on your tax return, but do not include any kind of punctuation, no periods, no commas, anything like that. If you had an apartment number and it says APT, make sure you use that exact lettering APT. But basically, it's just a matter of getting it just right to put it in there. So, like I said, alternate. If the 19 return isn't accepted, try your 2018 return.
All right, this question is for Miss Gaines. My husband and I received $2,400 stimulus payment by direct deposit, but did not receive anything for our two children, ages 4 and 6, who have always been on our tax return as dependents. How do I receive the additional $1,000?
Unfortunately, I have heard this one a few times this week already. Basically, we are waiting additional guidance on how the IRS is going to be able to address this. Constituents may need to wait until we can get some of our toll-free assisters back on the phone to address it. And with that said, the economic impact payment is an advance credit for the tax year 2020. So if for some reason you're not able to recoup that $1,000 immediately, you will be, it's possible you would be eligible to claim that on your 2020 tax return in 2021 and get that. But hopefully once we get our phone lines open, we'll be able to get an account assister to look at that for you.
Okay, I filed my 2019 tax return early in January and made much more income than in 2018. Can I have my stimulus payment be calculated from my 2018 return? If the 2019 return is used, I will receive much less money.
Okay. So on that one, the IRS is actually using the most recent return processed. So if your 2019 return hasn't been completely by the time we get to issuing your economic impact payment, it may be that we issue it based on 2018. However, if your 19 return has completed processing, then you may get the smaller amount based on your 19 return. And once again, that is the economic impact payment is an advance credit for 2020. So if for some reason your income decreases in tax year 2020, like many people is, unfortunately, then you may be able to recoup any difference between the maximum amount and what you received on your 2020 tax return when you file it in 2021.
Okay, Andrew would like to know where taxpayers can go to get non-economic impact payment IRS issues resolved.
So, Andrew, that is a very popular question right now. As I mentioned, several of our staff are unable to get to the office and do not have the ability to work at home. And so some of this, I'm sure, has been difficult for you. I'm not sure of the specific issue that you're having. However, there are a lot of online options available on the IRS website, things such as obtaining your transcripts, setting up payment plans, things like that. It just depends on your issue. Now, if it's a 2019 refund that hasn't been received, if it's an audit that you're going through, it just depends on the issue. You may be able to reach out to the local taxpayer advocate office or reach out to Congressman Casten's staff. Maybe they can field that question a little better for you, and we can help you find out if there is something that we can do now, or if it's something we're just going to have to wait till our staff comes back to work.
All right, Dawn has this question for my dad. She says, states like Illinois have mismanaged our tax dollars for decades. What will keep Illinois from using federal aid to bail out the pension system?
Well, I guess I'd reframe the question a little bit, Dawn. Part of the challenge, and I think most of the challenge in Illinois, and Congressman Foster has been really a leading advocate on this issue, is that the ways Illinois gets vastly less money back from the federal government than we pay out. And it is factually correct that Illinois has been running a deficit for a long time. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But if Illinois got the same amount of money per capita as, say, Indiana gets from their Medicaid program, Illinois wouldn't have a deficit. The average, Illinois sends about, for every dollar that we send to the federal government in income taxes, we get back between 70 and 80 cents. The average state gets back about $1.10. So what's happened, and this isn't because of any fault of the Illinois state government in Springfield. It's not through any fault of the representation Illinois has had in Washington. It's really a function of the fact that that most of the funding allocations, that in fact I would submit all of the funding allocations that are done federally have to pass the Senate. And the Senate ultimately doesn't represent people. The Senate represents land. Me in the 6th Congressional District, I have the privilege and the obligation to represent the interests of about 750,000 people in Illinois. If you live in Wyoming, there's about 500,000 people who live there, and you have not only one member of Congress, but you also have 2 senators. So the land in Wyoming is vastly better represented than the land in Illinois. And there's always been that inequity in our funding system. Our highway funding system overfunds rural states. Our Medicaid system overfunds rural states. But it's become really magnified in this CARES program. The Illinois received through the CARES Act about $350 per capita. Small states like Vermont received as much as $2,100 per capita. It's pretty easy to balance your budget if you're getting that much more money and you have that many fewer demands on your resources. And so one of the things that Congressman Foster and I have put a letter in, have asked the Speaker, Minority Leader McCarthy, Senator McConnell, and Minority Leader Schumer, is that in the future funding, the virus spreads through humans. The costs of the virus are much more highly concentrated in highly populated areas because that's where the humans are. And we should, if we want to make sure that we put this public health crisis to rest as quickly as possible and make sure that the resources flow where it needs to go, we should make sure that the distributions are made on a per capita basis. If we do that, it'll be good for the whole country because we'll get healthier quicker. And it will also take away this unusual burden that we have historically placed on states like Illinois that have essentially been subsidizing people in other states.
All right, this is a question from Sarah. Why are American citizens prohibited from receiving stimulus funds if they filed jointly and are married to green card holders?
This was a political problem. We pushed hard for it in the House and we couldn't get it through the Senate. We are fighting to try to reconcile it. We're fighting to try to reconcile it retroactively. But it's, I apologize, we didn't get it done. We just simply could not get the Senate to agree in the last bill to make sure that everybody gets paid, even if they are, fully legal immigrants to this country who are working here, who are paying taxes, who are contributing. Just because they're not citizens doesn't mean they're not eligible, but we couldn't get the Senate to agree to that in the last round.
Okay, Karen would like to know if the IRS is behind on refunds for 2019 taxes. A friend filed electronically on April 14th and received his state refund, but not federal. When she checks the status of her refund online, it says it's still being processed.
Karen, I'm going to use my favorite IRS word here, and that word is generally, because that means in most cases, then, or in almost every case, the IRS issues these refunds within 3 weeks. So April 14th, we're just sitting at 2 weeks right now. So ask your friend to be patient and give us another week and to keep checking that Where's My Refund tool on IRS.gov. If in another week it hasn't updated, then maybe she should be concerned. But I think we're just a little premature on that one right now.
All right, this will be our last question. Becky checked the IRS website tool and it noted that she would receive a letter from the IRS. What letter will she receive from the IRS?
Yes, Becky, the CARES Act required that the IRS send out a notice to each constituent within 15 days from the date that their economic impact payment check or direct deposit was issued, to let them know, first, this is the address we have on file for you, but also here's the amount of your payment, and here's the way that we submitted your payment to you, whether by direct deposit or by mail. So we want to make sure that folks are actually receiving the payments, and therefore we're sending the letters to make sure they receive them. And just a hint, we need everyone to hold on to these letters for a year if they are income tax filers, because they will need to have, remember the amount that they received. They do their tax return for 2020 so that if they are entitled to an additional amount, that they can help compute that when they file their tax returns. A lot of the questions that I've been asked today, we do have in the frequently asked question section on irs.gov. And when my slide was up, you could see the irs.gov/coronavirus. That's where you're going to find a lot of this information, including information about this particular notice.
Well, Susan, thank you so much. I think since this is Facebook Live, it will stay here in perpetuity until eternity, or Facebook disappears as a company. So you can always just slide your cursor back and go back to see Susan's slide. But thank you so much for your time, Susan. Any closing comments that you have as we wrap up here?
Just again, what irs.gov/coronavirus has a wealth of information, not only about the economic stimulus payments, but about the new employer tax credits available for those businesses suffering from the coronavirus itself, and additional information about normal IRS services as well. So irs.gov/coronavirus for all of your IRS needs. And
Well,
thank you all. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you again, Susan, and thanks to everybody for listening in and for all of the collective sacrifices we're making right now. I want to maybe just end just with a couple numbers because I think the context here is important to understand. The last year's federal budget was about $5 trillion. In the last 45 days, we have injected almost 3 trillion additional emergency dollars into the economy. And you know, as I think is obvious from the tenor of a lot of the questions here, we're not meeting everybody's needs with that volume of money. There still are a lot of gaps. There's still a lot of shortfalls. There's still a lot of people making sacrifices. And when I was on a call with Chairman Powell's office from the Federal Reserve and was asking them sort of what their outlook was for the economy, they said, you know, realistically, we're in a point where anybody who has cash reserves is probably going to be spending them down, and anybody who has the ability to deficit spend is probably going to have to deficit spend, because that's just what you have to do if you're a decent moral person who wants to get through this with as little pain as possible. And from a fiscal perspective, the one bit of good news there is that we are still the country that every other country in the world wants to invest in, which means that we will have access to very cheap money for the foreseeable future. I expect that if not in the next bill, certainly in ones that will follow soon, we'll be looking at significant infrastructure investments to try to rebuild the economy and to take advantage of the fact that as long as we have cheap money, let's use it. You know, let's use cheap debt to build great equity returns and you know, restore the economic vitality that we had. But the first thing we got to do is we got to get through this public health crisis, because if we start opening up too quickly and the rate of infection goes back geometrically, we're going to be way worse off than we are right now. So we will continue to be in this time that's going to require a lot of collective self-sacrifice for all of us. I thank you all for the sacrifice that you're making, and I thank you all for being decent and civil. I was chatting with some folks this morning that I don't think there is anybody in our society right now who thinks that they have power in excess of their responsibilities. We've all got responsibilities in excess of our power right now, and people are making the best way they are because they're good, decent people. And thank you for being good and decent. Thank you all. Good night.